Welcome, dear colleagues, at this 184th day of our resistance. This is Natalia Staroprava, and we start our series of briefings. Today, we have Volodymyr Yermolenko, philosopher, journalist, analytics director at Internews Ukraine, editor-in-chief at Ukraine.org. Today, we will be talking about Russian propaganda, what it means, that is why. The floor is yours, Mr. Yermolenko, and I will start with the following question. So, what is Russian propaganda, and which tools is Russia using for it? Thank you. I want to welcome everyone in Lviv. I'm really happy to be in Lviv. It is the first visit after the 21st of February to Lviv. Well, I'm a philosopher. I'm a person who also knows a lot about journalism. I will try to offer you some reflections about some deeply rooted reasons for Russian propaganda, historical as well. When we talk about Russian propaganda, very often we talk about this disinformation. So we envision that it is total lies, and it is actually so. But I think that there is another very important aspect of Russian propaganda, which is dehumanization. The fact that the Russian media have been doing for past decades, it has been an attempt to dehumanize Ukrainians, to dehumanize Europeans, to dehumanize Americans, as well as other peoples, to show that they are not really humans. And the key narrative here, as we all know, is about this idea that Ukrainians are Nazis and fascists. But when we try to delve deeper, we understand that in fact this logic is not really clear, because if these are people are not really human beings, if they are fascists and Nazis, it means that we have the right to kill them. And before the 24th of February, when Putin was talking about genocide of Ukrainians, well, people who were responsible for genocide in the Donbass, he was getting ready and he was preparing his population that genocide against Ukrainians was needed. And I think that is important for us to be mindful of that. One of the key goals for propaganda is not so much about lying. It's more about the fact that your enemy does not exist as such, that Ukrainians are a nation which never existed, that Europe will fall apart, that the US will also fall apart. Or what you can also do is to say that your opponent has no right to exist. That is why we have this narrative about fascists as Nazis. Let's dig deeper and talk about the past, because right now we have the discussion across the world about Russian culture. And it seems to me that we should be really reasonable when we talk about Russian culture, because especially when I want to refer to people from other countries, because it's very important to have this very reasonable approach when you talk about culture, and this is what is happening in Europe and in the world. And Russian culture is not really any better, because when we take a look at Pushkin, we have to apply the same criteria or even tougher criteria as we use for Flaubert, Kipling, Joseph Conrad, and other writers who are being analyzed in terms of colonialism and other trends in the West. So when we take Poltava, written by Pushkin, we will see how he depicted Ukrainian Cossacks, and he describes them as people who really want to be brutal, who want to be very cruel. And if to translate it, he describes them as fascists and Nazis, that those people who have to be forgotten, very brutal future. And Mazepin for Pushkin is the same as Banderitsi is for Russian propaganda. The same can be said when we talk about his other work, Klevetnikam for Russia, and this is the response to Polish rebellion. It's not about Ukrainians who are suffering from this empire. We will see some messages which are very similar to what Russian propaganda has right now. We talk about threats to Europe. We can repeat it because this is what Pushkin, how he phrased it, how he put it into words, as well as the idea that the West does not really have to interfere into some business which is only about the Slavs. When we talk about Russian propaganda, we have to remember about deeply rooted reasons for this concept, and we should not think that this is something which started just a couple of months ago. So we are in 6 months into the war. So what about the change in terms of tools of Russia propaganda, and why we can still see that West is being impacted by the trust? I think that the West no longer believes that this Russian propaganda so much. We can see that there are very many ideas that our Western partners, before that, they did not really believe Ukrainians when we tried to convince them that looking for neo-Nazis in Ukraine, you constant search for them, this is something which was not really healthy. That is why I think that this narrative about Ukrainians is winning over in the West. I wouldn't say that we have already won. I understand that there will be another wave of Russian propaganda that Ukraine should not receive any weapons because, well, because of the way it is used. And again, we will have this narrative about the country, which is some kind of a construct, which is not real, which is an understate. But I think that we really have to be careful, not only to some things which are happening in other parts of the world. We can talk about global south. I don't really like this concept, but Russia is trying to do the following thing right now. The more crimes it commits, then the more resistance it can feel from Ukraine, from the West, by means of sanctions. And then it starts to say that the West does not really like us, that, this is actually very imperialistic approach. And Russia is doing something which it has been doing for very many years in its internal policy of other countries. We can talk about this polarization of different states as far as its policy is concerned. But it's about polarization of the world. So they want really their dream to come true, for the world to become bipolar, like, to have this bipolar trend again, and that Russia will become a leader of this anti-Western world. That is why it's important to address not only the West, but also Asian countries, African countries, the countries of Latin America. And there is one simple message that I would like to address with. Russia wants to show itself as an anti-imperialistic power against Western imperialism. But in fact, Russia is an empire, and it is one of the most cruel empires in our history. When we talk about history of Europe of the past 2 centuries, we talk about history of decolonization, deimperialization. Yes, there are some terrible pages when in the history of the 19th, 20th century. We can talk about Nazism and fascism and other things. But right now, this history is being revised in terms of different understanding. And that is why Russia is the only empire in Europe. Volodymyr, probably we could. You mentioned ideological trends, fascism and Nazism, and we also call in Ukraine Russians fascists, and we also recognize that there is a certain ideology that they stick to. So what about their ideology? Fascism is a nice meme. I really like this meme, but for me, for a philosopher, it is a little bit problematic, and I can explain why. Because we say that Putinism is a certain version of fascism of the 21st century, Mussolini, Franco, Hitler, and others. Yes, we can draw parallels between these two regimes, but we also have to understand that this crimes of Russian political system is deeply rooted into past centuries. It didn't start in the last 2 centuries. During one of the discussions we talked with Anatoly Podolsky, who is a historian, and he mentioned that Gulag was before gas chambers, before Nazis' chambers. And we have to understand that Gulag started before, this Russian imperialism started before, then some wars that Russia led, the destruction of statehood in the 18th century of Russian, Polish, Crimean, Tatar territories, then Baturin, all these atrocities. It is a certain line, a political line of Russian culture, and it believes that this cruelty is the key criterion of power. The more cruel you are, the more power you have. And these relations between people in society are about hierarchy, are about domineering, are about violence and intimidation. I think it's important for us to analyze these things and to be aware of them. There is one drastic difference when we talk about Nazism, and here I would like to address probably our international listeners. In the 20th century, there was this absolute evil, and here we talk about Nazism and Holocaust. But I think that yes, they are absolute evil. These are terrible, terrible things. But we do not really have to focus on a hierarchy of evil. We do not say that Holocaust and Nazism are absolute evil, but the rest is like lesser evil, and that it means that it should not be condemned. And just because we don't really have this condemnation as far as Stalinism was concerned, we do face the situation which we have right now. So genocide against Ukrainians is a repeated genocide against Ukraine. It is something which is still on. It has not been condemned. There is a difference between Nazism and Russism, and this difference lies in the fact that for Nazism, it tried to build this hierarchy of alive creatures. So a certain group of people, they have the right to live, and there is another group of people, and they do not deserve to be here to live. And of course, it is a terrible crime. And Russian ideology, from historical perspective, does not really care much about the life of people. We know how they won their wars, sacrificing so many people, and we see how they treat their soldiers. They do not really disclose any information about casualties, about death toll. They do not bury them. They do not take them away. So they do not really value human lives. And I think this is a distinguishing features when we talk about this other type of absolute evil Nazism. So before that, we wouldn't hear a lot about Ukraine, but today we know that all headlines, the media, is all about Ukraine. So what about Ukraine? What kind of a player Ukraine is on the international arena? What about these factors uh, affecting this change? I think it is a very important question for us Ukrainians, because this war is the story about ours winning our agency and our belief in ourselves. And I think this is something we started in 2014. I had this text published in 2014, Dreams About Europe, and I mentioned that probably Ukrainians are not ideal Europeans when I talk about abiding by different norms, rule of law, observing all of these things, especially when we talk about like rules and their observation as it is in the European sense. But they can teach this older Euro how to believe in itself. And over the past decades, over the past years, we can see a certain collapse when we talk about trust of the Western world into themselves, their belief. And those things which actually gave rise to Western culture, they are an instrument and they are a source of some problems. For example, democracy, the freedom of the media, and the social media. That's the trend we started, but I think that this is some kind of a masochist trend when we try to do some research from inside. And of course, our democracy is also not ideal, but we understand that there are some external enemies. And the key problem is not about democracy from the inside. This is something which happens from the outside. And democracy should really believe in itself, and it should be fierce. It should revive not only this ethos of a compromise, but also an ethos of a soldier, not just ethos of people who agree with each other, but also ethos of people who fight for their freedom. And it is very important when you talk to our German colleagues. And Germany supports Ukraine. We can see humanitarian aid and many other things. Of course, that we have some questions when I talk about weapons supply. But there is one idea that I heard from my German colleague, that Germans did not really win their democracy. They lost the war, and that was the way for them to attain this democracy. And for Ukrainians, it's a different thing. So they want to achieve this democracy by winning. That is why these subtleties are very important, and they show that Ukraine does not only take a lot from the world, and we are grateful for this immense support, but we can also give a lot to this democratic and free world. Thank you, Volodymyr, for these very timely reflections. We had Volodymyr Yermolenko, philosopher, journalist, analytics director at Internews Ukraine, and editor-in-chief at Ukraine World. So we will have another meeting, and we will talk about